Good afternoon, everyone, and a really warm welcome to this webinar on understanding self-harm, which is presented by Place to Be with funding from Education Scotland. My name's Sarah Hayward. I'm a trainer with Place to Be, based in Scotland. I'm based in Edinburgh, and for 8 years I was also a school-based clinician for Place to Be. So working with our partner primary and secondary schools in Edinburgh, actually delivering and managing a mental health service directly for our partner schools. I'm delighted to be joined in conversation this afternoon by my Place to Be colleague, Becky Wilkinson Quinn. Becky, hello, and would you like to introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about the learning intentions for the session?
Sure, I'm delighted to be here, Sarah, thank you. So I'm Becky Wilkinson Quinn and I am the clinical lead for Scotland and for Wales, but similar to Sarah, I started life in our schools, in 2 schools in Edinburgh as a school project manager for about 8 years, and then I've been a trainer with Place to Be. I've also been a cluster manager through in Glasgow and a service manager across Ayrshire, Edinburgh and Dundee. So some quite diverse experience with Place to Be across Scotland. So that's me.
Yeah, it really is a lot of different experiences. So great to be able to speak with you this afternoon about self-harm. And interestingly, we both also are art psychotherapists. So just to mention that as well. Shall I get the learning intentions up on the screen and you can tell us a little bit about the session?
That would be great. Sarah's in charge of our slides today. So our learning intentions for this session are, we want you to understand what self-harm is, how to spot it, and why children and young people might do it. And we hope that you will, as a result of today's session, feel more confident to support children and young people who self-harm, to know where to look for further information and resources, and to understand the importance of seeking your own support because it is an emotive subject.
Yeah. Thank you, Becky. Yes, we'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. But while it's at the top of my mind, folks, I just wanted to let you know as well, there'll be a chance to offer some evaluation on this session, and we would really love to hear your views because what we hope to offer today is something that is going to help you to feel more confident, as Becky said, in supporting children and young people who might present with self-harming behaviours. So I'll just show a little bit about the structure of this session. We'll be together until 4 o'clock, and we plan to have some time at the end of the session for your questions and hopefully some good answers from Becky and I. So please do, as we go through the session this afternoon, please do pop your questions into the Q&A box, and Becky will be keeping an eye on that for us and we'll be able to answer some questions at the end. So in terms of what the session looks, we're going to start off just with a little bit of introduction and a little bit about safeguarding. We have a section on what is self-harm, so just to help us to understand the territory a little better. We have a section on how can I help. So again, our aim this afternoon is primarily to support your well-being by helping you feel more confident in this territory. And then most importantly, we've got a section at the end called how can we look after ourselves. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So let's have a look, folks. First of all, just a little bit about safeguarding and self-care. Now, I'm sure this is not going to be a surprise to any of you tuning in to this webinar, but we know that any disclosure of self-harm in a school context must be treated as a safeguarding concern. So if a child or a young person tells you that they have self-harmed, or even just that they're considering self-harm, you need to let your school safeguarding officer know about that. And that's the case even if the self-harm is historical. So even if it's not current, it's not happening now, it's important that you let your safeguarding officer know about it. And of course, don't forget to let the child or the young person know that you'll need to share that information. As Becky mentioned, self-harm can be a very sensitive and disturbing, I suppose, subject, particularly if we're not familiar with it. So please do take a break from this session if you need to. Look after yourself. The recording will be available. So if you need to step back from it, no problem. You'll be able to catch up on the rest of the session later. And as we go through, there are signposts for your own support, including on the next slide. So most importantly, if you find yourself in a place of crisis, your GP is always the best first point of contact. But there are, of course, other services available. Some of them on this slide here, available all of the time, and we'll put this slide back up at the end of the session before we finish today. So, Becky, shall we get started?
Before we do though, Sarah, there's something in our Q&A box, and I'm just wondering if I can hand it over to Natalie, our technical support person today. We have somebody who's struggling to get in there, Natalie. I don't know whether you've seen that, so I'm just flagging that up for your attention.
Fantastic, thank you, Becky. That's good to help that person get in. So we thought, didn't we, we'd start off just with a little bit of thinking about some really common ideas that are out there in the world about self-harming behaviour. And what I thought we could do is just get the first set of 5 up on the screen. And actually, you and I just pause for a moment to give the folks tuning in a chance to read them and to start to think about their own responses to those statements. And folks, again, if you want to pop any sort of responses, observations, comments into the Q&A box, you're welcome to do that. So, what do you think about self-harm? The first 4, sorry, not 5 here. So self-harm is rare. Self-harmers must enjoy pain. Self-harm is attention-seeking behaviour. And self-harm usually affects goths or emos. So Becky, I'll just give it a moment while folks are digesting those statements. Oh. And then you and I perhaps could throw in some of our own thoughts and comments about some of these. So again, folks, very sort of not uncommon ideas to hear about self-harm, and I guess no response to this is wrong, but Becky and I thought that we would just respond with our own experience, really, having both worked in schools over a number of years. So Becky, the first one, self-harm is rare. What's your experience of that?
From a professional point of view, the disclosures that we receive would suggest that it's not a rare occurrence. I don't want people to be thinking that it's happening to every young person and child that comes into our service either, but we do see self-harm disclosures come in, and we have seen a bit of a rise in that over the pandemic and with COVID. I would say that it's an interesting one. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Sarah, because there can be shame that's wrapped up with self-harming behaviour, and it can be for some of a hidden nature as well. So you have to factor that in as well.
Yeah, that's true, Becky, isn't it? And we'll come on to some statistics in a few slides' time, but I think you're right. It's important to bear in mind that actually it's quite difficult to really accurately get a sense of self-harming behaviours because, as you say, for a lot of people, it's something that is done privately and it's not done in a way that would attract attention to it. So I wonder if we go on to number 2 then, self-harmers must enjoy pain. What do you make of that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. It's easy to see why people might jump to that conclusion. I think it depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about pain, for me, quite often self-harm is done in a response to psychological pain, and it's done to relieve psychological pain rather than inflict physical pain on oneself. What would you say about that, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's my experience too. And you're talking to young people, is that sometimes, interestingly, self-harming behaviour is about feeling more alive or coming back into the body, but not necessarily about the pain aspect of it. Can also, for some young people, be a way of sort of punishing themselves if they feel that they deserve to feel pain. But we'll talk a little bit more maybe about the kind of drivers or the things that might lead somebody to self-harm later in the presentation. So that is an interesting one to consider. What about self-harm is attention-seeking behaviour? What would you say to that?
I'm smiling because it's one of my bugbears this term, attention seeking. I suppose it just flags to me. I prefer the term attention needing, so it flags up a need that somebody might have and a need for support. And quite often, I think, as you highlighted, Sarah, that it can be a private activity, coping strategy that people are engaged in. So rather than to draw attention to themselves, it could be a way of coping for some.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we'll look at a kind of a model again, as we said, of the kind of drivers or the things that might trigger somebody to be in a place of wanting to hurt themselves later on. And then number 4, then self-harm usually affects goths or emos. Again, it's not uncommon to hear folks thinking that it affects some groups within our society more than others. But what's your experience of that, Becky?
Yeah, not at all, really. I think we need to think about self-harm in terms of, you know, people's mental health, and I'm saying people because I'm not wanting to separate out, you know, adults from children and young people as well, that we're all affected at some point in our lives by poor mental health. So it can affect anybody at any time in all sort of factions of society, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what the statistics tell us, actually, isn't it? That it affects all demographics. And I think that's a really important point, actually, that while we're focusing on self-harm in relation to children and young people today to try to support education professionals, it's not something that's just out there that young people are doing. Of course, it's something that affects adults also. And we're very conscious in this session that it's statistically, it's pretty much impossible that nobody tuning into this session has been affected by self-harm, either in their own lived experience or because we know and we care about somebody who's been affected by self-harm. So I think it's really important, Becky, actually, that you mentioned that it's not an us and them sort of a situation. So that's why we're so kind of conscious, aren't we, of self-care this afternoon and taking care of ourselves as we listen to these ideas and these statistics. Should we move on to the next slide? And I'll do the same again. I'll just pause for a moment to let folks read what's on the slide, and then we could get into our own ideas about them. So on this slide, we've got only girls self-harm. Self-harmers are prone to copycat behaviours. Talking about self-harm will make it more likely to happen. And then people who self-harm want to end their lives. So again, some interesting ideas out here that are not at all atypical of what we might hear out on social media, for example, or in the press. So Becky, what about only girls self-harm? I guess we've kind of touched already on this, but say a little bit about your experience of it.
Yeah, I think we have touched on it a little bit, haven't we? I think that research shows that girls are actually, you know, there's a slight prevalence towards the drivers, you know, to self-harm. However, you know, as we said in the previous point, I think the previous myth, if you like, that it affects all genders, you know, all walks of life, all parts of society, and you know, that you could interpret that in lots of different ways, couldn't you? I mean, certainly my experience in schools, in our self-referral part of the service, for example, that you would tend to see more girls in that part of the service than boys, because a lot of girls feel more able to come and bring the emotional, their emotional world, I suppose, and share that and think about that. So it can be interpreted in lots of different ways, so it's just being careful around that. It certainly doesn't only affect girls, of course.
Yes, yes, I think that's absolutely right, Becky. And I guess that bit as well about it being hidden is important. I suppose particularly if we're thinking about boys and young men and men who, as you say, just traditionally in our culture, maybe it's not been so easy for boys and men to share their emotional distress and to come forward and say that they're struggling, and it's not always been welcome for boys and men to do that, actually. So as you say, maybe it's a bit difficult to get a handle on how many boys and men are affected actually by self-harm and behaviour. The other thing I think that's interesting here is that bit about self-harm hides in plain sight, and I'm thinking about boys and young men that I've worked with who their behaviour wouldn't necessarily be understood as self-harming in the first instance. So, you know, hitting doors or other things that look aggressive, and we might understand it as aggressive or fighting behaviour. Actually getting into fights sometimes might be an indication of a young person looking to hurt themselves. So I think that's a really interesting one, actually, when we think about gender.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about number 6? Self-harmers are prone to copycat behaviours. What would you say about that one?
I think it's something to be, it's certainly something I've heard. I think it's something to be really careful of, because I think it's got the risk of minimising what's going on for a young person. You know, that they're just copying. You know, yeah. But I think that I'm interested to hear what you think about that as well, Sarah, because I don't think that that's the whole of the story there either.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's right, isn't it? It's very complex. And for sure, again, statistically, we do see kind of clusters, I guess, of self-harming behaviour. And I've certainly come across in my work in high school particularly, that there's a group of young people who are affected at the same time by self-harming. I think the interesting thing, as you say, it's important to take each young person's story as it comes, and to really, you know, spend some time asking that young person what's happening for them, because it may not be that it's just straight copying. It might be that the stress and the strain of supporting a friend who's self-harming then triggers an episode of self-harm in another young person. And I think it's important just to bear in mind that it's important not to make assumptions. I guess that's kind of what you were saying earlier as well, to, you know, to really think about risk assessing each young person's situation. The other thing I just want to note for this statement, and we had one on the last slide as well, where the language of self-harmer was presented, and I just want to put in a note of caution about that. Actually, that I think it's a bit tricky to label anybody in terms of a behaviour. So for me, it's important to talk about self-harming behaviour as separate from the person, and not to describe somebody as a self-harmer, because that's not the only part of their identity or their experience. So yeah, just wanted to get that one in there as well. What about this one, Becky? That I think is such an understandable fear, really, that if we talk about self-harm, it's going to make it more likely to happen. How would you think about that one as a clinician?
I think the more information that people have, the better, to help them to understand what's going on for them psychologically. And for some young people, that's a very powerful thing, understanding, you know, how their mind works actually, and normalizing to a certain extent, you know, what's going on for them, helping them to have some understanding about their behaviours, because without that, that can feel really quite frightening, I think.
Yeah.
So that would be my take on it. I don't know if you want to add though, Sarah.
I totally agree with that, Becky. I think my experience, again, is that it's really important to talk about it for exactly the reasons that we mentioned earlier, that there is still a lot of stigma and taboo around self-harm, and much self-harming behaviour is hidden for that reason, that folks are worried about coming forward and saying this is something that I'm experiencing. So for me, actually, when I've worked in schools, I've actually gone the other way, and I've tended to ask young people directly if I've got a concern about them, or if I think it's something that they might be affected by, because I want to give them space and permission to be able to talk about it, and to not feel that it's something you shouldn't say or you shouldn't mention, because it might upset somebody else, or it might make them angry, for example. So actually, again, as far as we can tell from research evidence, there's no evidence that just talking about it to somebody is going to make someone who doesn't already self-harm start self-harming. So important to know that, I think. And I think it links to the last statement here, which again is, I think, a really common and understandable concern that folks might have, that if somebody is self-harming, that means they want to end their lives. And actually, Becky, I'm not going to ask you to say much about it here, because the next slide we dig into this a little bit more, don't we? Shall I get that one up for you?
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just going to start by reading out this quote from the Mental Health Foundation. So, it's often the belief that self-harm is closely linked to suicide that frightens people the most. So the vast majority of those who self-harm are not trying to kill themselves. They're trying to cope with difficult feelings, and for many, it's a way of staying alive. Having said this, many people who have taken their own lives have self-harmed in the past. So this is why self-harming must be taken seriously. So just to sort of highlight a couple of things from that quote, is that self-harming behaviour can be a coping strategy for many and a way of staying alive, but that we still need to take it seriously. So there's not necessarily a link, a direct link, but we do need to take it seriously, which I think links into what you were saying earlier, Sarah, around the safeguarding aspect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's just a helpful link here to an e-learning resource, which is really great, all about suicide prevention. So if you want to explore that further, so that's with the Zero Suicide Alliance.
Great, thank you, Becky. Yeah, that is a really helpful training actually, and it's freely available to anyone. So we're not going to say any more this afternoon, folks, about suicidality specifically, because we know that that self-harm and suicidal ideation are not necessarily automatically linked. But if you would like to know more about supporting someone who's expressing suicidal feelings, it might be good to look at that e-learning. But we'll go on, Becky, to the sort of the first main part of our session this afternoon, which is what is self-harm. And of course, we've already got into this, really. We've already started talking about it and our experience of it. But I guess we thought it'd be useful just to sort of have a little bit of a closer look at the territory. So on the next slide, I'm going to, we've got, I suppose, lots of different kinds of self-harming behaviours here. I wonder if you would start us off just by saying, or sort of talking us through what we see here.
Yeah, sure. I think you said it earlier, Sarah. I think it's about opening up our frame of reference in how we define self-harm. And I think often the first thing that people think about is cutting with self-harming behaviour. But as you can see, and this is by no means obviously a definitive list, but there are lots of different ways in which people may engage in self-harming behaviour. So we have things like burning, stabbing, headbanging, cutting, trichotillomania. I always get a bit anxious before I say that, Sarah, but that is it's hair pulling. So it could be pulling from the head, it could be eyelashes. We have poor hygiene, so self-neglect, not looking after ourselves, self-poisoning, digital self-harm, which is a really interesting one, and actually the research shows us that there's a higher prevalence with males with digital self-harming. So digital self-harming, it's come on the scene fairly recently, and that could be where an individual abuses themselves verbally, in written form, over social media. For example, they may create a different profile for themselves and bully themselves really online. We have things like drug overdose, so substance use, so we have alcohol use in there as well. Got pinching, punching, starving, excessive risk taking. I just want to emphasize with this that obviously risk taking is a normal part of adolescent behaviour and an important part actually. However, we're talking about excessive risk taking here, so placing oneself in really risky situations. Got picking, burning, promiscuity, so that could link into the risk taking category as well. Inserting objects and swallowing objects, so it's a lovely list there, isn't it? But unfortunately by no means a definitive one. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about that, Sarah, though.
I think just to acknowledge, that what a wide range of ways actually that somebody could be hurting themselves, and and I also am struck, Becky, by some of these are about self-injury, specifically about harming the body. Yeah. Some of them are broader than that, so not about directly causing harm, damage deliberately to the body, but still ways of hurting ourselves. So yeah, I think you're right. It's a sobering list, but it's, I suppose, important to have it in our awareness. And we've got some definitions here of self-harm and self-injury, and maybe I'll just read these out quickly for folks. So you'll of course be getting the idea already that self-harm or deliberate self-harm includes, as we said, self-injury and self-poisoning, and it's defined as the intentional direct injury of body tissue, most often done, as we mentioned, without suicidal intention. And I really like, Becky, this quote here from Sutton and Martinson, who talk about self-injury as an expression of acute psychological distress. So it's an act done to oneself by oneself with the intention of helping oneself rather than killing oneself. So paradoxically, damage is done to the body in an attempt to preserve the integrity of the mind. And I really like the way that they draw out that paradox there between it seems counterintuitive to hurt yourself as a way of staying alive or keeping yourself kind of alive, if you like, keeping the mind alive. But that indeed is what some folks report. I think on the next slide, Becca, we've got some, we promised we'd talk a little bit about statistics. I'm always a little bit cautious about statistics, but would you sort of talk us through?
Yeah, I'll talk us through. Of course, they're always changing. I think, as I said earlier, you know, we have seen an increased prevalence, and I know that's certainly not exclusive to place to be in things like self-harming disclosures. So some of the statistics that we have, so we have one from the Centre of Mental Health. So 1 in 5 children will experience a mental health difficulty at least once during their first 11 years, which is, you know, it's pretty prevalent, isn't it, when you look at that? And for me, that just helps to normalise that to me. Mm-hmm. So around 10% of 15 to 16-year-olds are thought to self-harm. So that's a statistic from Young Minds. And rates are higher in girls than boys, although we've explored this a little bit, haven't we? And in young people who identify as LGBTQIA+. So that's from the Good Childhood Report 2018. So I suppose coming to the second statistic there as well, that often it's such an emotive subject, self-harming, that we can almost be like seeing it everywhere as well. And I don't want folk to come away from this thinking, you know, that it's all young people who are engaging in self-harming behaviour. You know, it's still relatively low, but we have to keep in mind the hidden nature of self-harm, and that the stats might not reflect that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. And yes, we touched on the sort of the gender differences, but I think important there to pick up from the Good Childhood Report about our young people who would identify as LGBTQIA+, and we know that that group of young people can be particularly overly affected, if you like, by mental health difficulties, and self-harming being one of those. So I think just important to have that in our awareness again. But as you said, it's really important as well not to feel that it's going to be all young people that we come across who are affected. And I think that's important for our next slide too, where we're looking at some of the warning signs or the red flags for self-harming behaviours. I won't read all of these out for you folks, they're there on the screen for you to see, but I suppose the important thing here is just to say that, as we said before, none of these things are definitely signs that self-harming is something that is affecting that child or that young person. So whether they're presenting with physical injuries or blood on their clothing, or they're having frequent accidents, asking for first aid supplies, not wanting to change their clothing, covering up their bodies, these things could well tell us not very much about that young person's situation, or it could be a sign actually of a different kind of safeguarding concern that we might need to look out for. But just, I think, good again to have these things in our awareness, that this is how young people might present to us. And again, just as there are many forms of self-harm, we can see there are many ways that it could come to our attention. I think the last one's really interesting, Becky, and quite important about, again, talking about self-harm in and of itself might not tell us that much, because, as you said, risk-taking and getting interested in risk-taking is a really important part of adolescence and growing up. And we see preteens as well getting quite interested in these sorts of issues. I suppose for me, it's if a young person suddenly seems really interested in it, and it's taken up a lot of their time and attention, and especially if they're talking about things like pro self-harm websites, that's when my warning system would be going off a little bit. Would that be true for you as well?
Oh, most definitely, yeah.
Okay. So we can see, as we said, there's lots of different ways that self-harming can present, lots of different things that might give us a bit of a clue that a young person is affected by this. But as we mentioned, the really interesting question is what would lead somebody to feel like they wanted to hurt themselves? And I think particularly if it's not been in our own lived experience, we might find that quite a difficult thing to understand. So Becky, on the next slide, I'm going to just talk us through this really simple, lovely model from Life Signs, which I would really highly recommend to colleagues that are joining us this afternoon. A very useful website, loads of interesting, useful resources there for yourselves as professionals and also for young people and for families. The model here I like because it is quite simple. So of course it won't capture all scenarios, but we've basically got kind of two routes or two drivers for self-harming behaviour. On the left of the diagram, in the orange column, we've got a situation where somebody's feeling very stressed. So they're hyper stressed. They might be feeling overwhelmed, not able to cope, maybe exposed and sensitive. Over on the right hand side of the model, in the blue column, we've almost got the opposite situation. Somebody whose distress is presenting as being dissociated, so maybe cut off from their feelings. They're not experiencing stress directly. They might be feeling quite numb, lost, unreal, alone, or disconnected. But the interesting thing is that both of those situations can lead to a person self-injuring as a way of getting into a different state, if that makes sense, Becky. Mm-hmm. And I guess on the left, we've got, you know, the in comes a trigger. So somebody's feeling generally stressed, and then something happens that tips them over from just feeling stressed into wanting to act on it. And self-injury being an action that they can take to try and relieve that stress. So in the left-hand side of the diagram, we're looking at potentially somebody who's then feeling quite relieved or released or in control, or maybe just calmer as a result of taking that action, to kind of like a pressure valve, really, taking some of that pressure away. On the right-hand side of the diagram then, for the person who was feeling dissociated, cut off from their feelings, the self-injury might be a way, and we touched on this earlier, to feel real and alive, back in the body, functional, able to act, a bit more kind of grounded, if you like. So Becky, what are your thoughts on that model? What do you make of it?
I think it's a really useful model, like you say, Sarah, to really think about to use your word, the drivers. So what's behind and how it might present differently. I suppose it just strikes me that those are two very, very different things with two very different resulting outcomes, aren't they, as a result of the self-injury. So I suppose for me it's just really useful to hold in mind that they can be coming from different places.
Yeah,
and functioning as coping strategies for different reasons, you know.
Absolutely, yeah, and coping with big feelings at some level, whether it's too much feeling or not enough feeling, I suppose is the interesting thing that they have in common. So given all of this, folks, I guess our next big question is, how on earth can I help then if I'm presented with a child or a young person who's disclosing that they've self-harmed? What could I be doing that's supportive? So Becky, would you tell us first of all about some immediate responses that might be?
Yeah, sure. So there's a really nice acronym here, and please don't feel that you need to remember the acronym and what all the letters stand for. So it's from Scotland's Mental Health First Aid for Young People. So I just think the word in itself is useful to remember, which is care. So we have C, which is showing concern. We have A, which is conveying acceptance. We have R, which is showing respect. And we have E, which is communicating empathy. And for me, it's really around that empathy, actually, for me, being the most important part of it, which care brings to me that word. And just the lack of the shaming element, so it's that acceptance. So it's meeting the young person with empathy and showing acceptance and respect, whilst also showing your concern that we're taking this seriously. But for me, the most important bit is connecting with empathy, because I mean, I think that when you're in a situation where you've got a young person in front of you who is disclosing something like that, you know, our own responses to that, our own anxiety, you know, can be heightened. So it's really finding a way, and our mind can be running away with us. It's finding a way to really stay with that young person, for me, which is the most important first port of call for me.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. And I suppose we're gonna expand on that a little bit, aren't we, on the next slide, with some really concrete things about things that are very much informed by research, actually, about what folks find helpful.
Absolutely. So giving permission, I think you said this earlier, Sarah, in terms of your day-to-day practice. So giving permission to talk about self-injury by asking about it. You know, so if you are concerned that a young person might be engaged with that type of behaviour, absolutely, there's nothing terrible going to happen by asking about it. Just the opposite. If that is indeed the case, you can be there to support. So what's also helpful is active listening. So it's trying to regulate yourself. And it's coming back to that staying connected with the young person and really listening. So really calm, kind, accepting response. So as I say, our anxieties can really be raised when faced with a situation like that, and you can move into, oh gosh, you know, what do I need to do? But it's about trying to regulate yourself and stay calm in that moment, and accepting. Really important, I think, is number 4, is your boundaries. So it's being clear about what you can do and what you can't do, including the limits of confidentiality. And absolutely, we should not be supporting somebody in isolation. You may be the first person that a person has disclosed to, but it certainly shouldn't end with that, you know. I think offering some control over what happens next, it could be quite a frightening experience when a young person discloses. So they may not have control over, for example, that this needs to be communicated. If it's within a school environment, most likely the head teacher or the deputy head or a member of guidance staff, but there may be some control offered in how that happens. You know, do you want me to go and speak to Mrs. Smith about this with you? Do you want to do it yourself? So offering some control over the next step. So this is what needs to happen, but you know, what might that look like, you know? Making space to talk about what's distressing the person. So either in that moment or at another time, that's fine to do it, you know, and follow up, making another time to do that. And information and signposting. So it's really about, you know, educating ourselves. So we've got a little toolkit that we can pull out. So we've got some great suggestions here with the self-soothe box from Young Minds. We've got harm reduction advice from Life Signs, which Sarah highlighted, and the 15-minute rule, which is about trying to build up the amount of time between the urge to self-harm and the actual act of self-harming. And signposting to other services and support's really important, that we're not working in a silo.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. Yeah, I would definitely recommend, as I said, that Life Signs website is brilliant for information about other services and supports. And I do love both of these things that are on the slide, the self-soothe box and the 15-minute rule. Quite simple things, but useful to have in your own toolkit because a young person might not be aware of it. So a self-soothe box just being like an emotional first aid kit, kind of a collection of objects, often sensory objects, things that smell good or feel good on the skin, you know, and a snack that you really like the taste of, but just something that brings us back into our body in a healthier kind of way. And the 15-minute rule, as you said, Becky, just a way to build in a buffer between that urge to hurt yourself, and then you make an agreement with yourself. I'm not going to hurt myself for 15 minutes, and I'm going to set a timer. And if I still feel the urge after that point, I can either decide to do that, or I can make another agreement with myself to not hurt myself for a period of time. And we're just trying to build in that time so that research again shows us that the urge dissipates over time. So if we can put in that buffer, somebody's much less likely to go through with the actual act of physically hurting themselves. So both, I think, just great that you've introduced us to those, because they're simple, but they're really, really effective in my experience with young people.
Absolutely, and they might involve things like distractions or ways of coping which don't cause harm. So by talking, walking, doing something creative, sports, whatever it is that's obviously relevant and appropriate and helpful to that young person, which will be different for everybody, won't it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we've got a wee URL later, a link for a really helpful resource about distractions. So I'll put that up in a couple of slides' time. But folks, we just wanted, for the last part of our session today, to really get into how can we look after ourselves, because as Becky mentioned right at the top of the session, and as I hope we've checked in with as we go through, this can be such an emotive, sensitive, distressing subject to hear about, particularly if we've not come across it before, and very frightening sometimes. So we wanted just to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we can look after ourselves in that kind of situation. And really, we start off always in place to be with the oxygen mask principle. Again, simple but effective. The idea being that if you're on an aeroplane and if there was some sort of emergency and the oxygen masks descended, you would always be advised to fit your own mask before you support somebody else. And sometimes that feels a bit counterintuitive, especially if we're with, say, a younger person. Our instinct might be to support them first, but we can only be in a good place to support others if we're in an okay place ourselves. And again, this is based on research evidence. We know that helping others can be risky business. So on the slide here, we've got a family of 4 different kinds of effects that we can experience by hearing the distress of others. So secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. And they're slightly different in their emphasis. I'm not going to say any more about them here, but if you're interested, there's plenty of information out there on the internet, for example, about the kind of the similarities and differences between these. But the key point is, we can, in putting ourselves in the way of other people's distress, we can take on some of that distress ourselves, and it can be very upsetting. So just want to reinforce, if you take nothing away from this session, that we would really encourage you and invite you to take really good care of yourself if you're supporting children and young people who are expressing these kinds of concerns about their well-being. So we can we can use, I suppose, Becky, the same acronym that we mentioned earlier to think about looking after ourselves. Would you say a little bit more about this one? Yeah,
sure. I mean, it's maybe a bit confusing, isn't it? It's the same acronym but with different meanings for each letter. But again, I think it's kind of a simple message for showing care for ourselves, and it's really important, as Sarah said, and using what supports feel appropriate for yourselves, including the GP and people like the Samaritans as well, for professionals as well who might be affected by these issues. So we've got C for staying calm, we've got A for accepting your limitations, and I can't stress that enough. We've got R, reaching out for help, so thinking about who might be a support for yourselves depending on how you've been affected by what you've experienced. And E, educating ourselves, so we've got that toolbox. It can also help with minimizing the emotional impact, actually, if we know some of the facts around self-harming.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. I think that's a good point. As you said earlier, I don't think it's about remembering what the CARE stands for necessarily in the heat of the moment. But I suppose it is just holding that word care in mind, isn't it? Care for ourselves as much as care for the young person.
And I think also, it might be something that you want to reflect on afterwards rather than in the moment. I mean, there's a lot going on in that moment, isn't there? So as long as we remember care for the young person and care for ourselves, it's something that you can come back to and just reflect on afterwards, I think.
I think that reaching out for help is really important as well, isn't it? We're reaching out for our own support. So after the fact, being just knowing that it's okay to go and talk to somebody about it, whether that's a colleague, somebody in your school leadership team, or, as you say, accessing one of those services that we've mentioned, like Breathing Space or Samaritans. just to, to have a confidential space to share that experience. I'm conscious of our time, Becky. We're coming up towards the end of our kind of pre-prepared presentation, but I think we've got some takeaway messages that you were just going to sort of talk us through, and then we could move to some questions.
Absolutely. So, as we've said, self-harm can be a way of coping, so stopping immediately might not be the best aim in the short term. So it might be more appropriate to think about safety and understanding as being more important. So stopping self-harm can take a long time because, as we know, it's a coping strategy for many, but we can acknowledge each step as a big achievement. So these might include things like taking better care of injuries, following the 15-minute rule, which we've discussed earlier, or reducing the severity of injuries. And we've got a link here, Sarah. I don't know if you want to say this. This is the link that you referred to earlier, wasn't it, around the distractions, and it's a really great resource. So trying out alternate ways of coping. Yeah, that's from the National Self-Harm Network, and I think it's a sort of small handout actually that you can print out, and it's very young person friendly, and it's just got tons of ideas on there of different ways that we might use our energy if we notice that urge to hurt ourselves. And last but not least, seeking help.
Yep, which we've mentioned already. Just a few more takeaway messages on this one for you, Becky.
Yeah. So just something really important to bear in mind, that self-harming behaviour can get worse for a while, as underlying issues are surfaced or explored, or when someone's living circumstances or ways of living are being changed. So that's just something to bear in mind. To reinforce again, as we did at the very beginning, that all disclosures of self-harm need to be treated as a safeguarding issue, that we all have the potential to make a positive difference in the lives of young people who self-harm, and most importantly, I think I've stressed it a couple of times, we don't have to do it alone. So looking after ourselves is really important when we're working with other people's acute distress.
Great, thank you, Becky. We have a couple more slides which I'll just put up at the end just to remind folks about sources of support for themselves and ways to keep in touch with Place to Be. But I wonder if this is a good moment to move over to the Q&A box and see if folks have got any questions or comments they'd like to share.
So I'll read them out, Sarah, because I think you're taken up with slides, aren't you? So we have a first question, which is, what are the pro self-harming sites that we're referring to?
Oh, good question. So I wouldn't give out specific sites, but what I mean by pro self-harm site is that there are websites out there on the internet which are very positive about self-harming behaviour, and we talk about it in kind of encouraging ways. Now, as we've discussed this afternoon, because self-harming is a coping strategy, I can totally understand why actually somebody would be putting something out there if they found it to be a useful coping mechanism for themselves. I suppose my concern, Becky, I don't know if you'd agree with this, is that if self-harm is being framed in very positive terms and as a kind of a thing that it's good to do and you should be doing it, particularly for kind of preteens and teenagers who are wanting to fit in and wanting to kind of feel like they're doing the things they're supposed to do as a teenager, I wouldn't want them to be influenced unduly by that kind of material. Does that sort of fit with what you would be thinking?
Yeah, 100%. I don't think I probably need to say any more about that, Sarah. I think for me that hits the nail on the head. Okay, so we have a second question. So could I please have advice on supporting a young person who self-harms and has recently started rolling her sleeves up so that others can see and talks about it openly with friends? She's recently self-harmed in front of a friend while at a sleepover.
Gosh, I don't know if you, well, do you want me to go first, Becky, with my...
Go first and I'll add in, Sarah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just to say thank you for sharing that question with us, and it sounds like a really tricky situation. It's not uncommon, sadly, as we've said, that really resonates with some of my experiences in schools. And we mentioned that sometimes there are clusters of self-harming behaviours in young people, and it sort of pops up in a particular group. I think what I would be thinking, first of all, just as we've said, and Becky, I love the phrase that you used earlier about attention needing or attachment seeking is another phrase that we use sometimes, that if a young person is showing openly that they are engaging in self-harming behaviours, I would be really curious to try and understand what's happening for that young person. You know, what's causing the distress that's leading to the self-harm, and what's the need that is being expressed when they are, you know, rolling up their sleeves and showing it in class, talking to friends about it. So I would, as we said, I would want to be bold and be quite courageous, and perhaps if the young person is willing, find a time to speak with them privately. And I would be saying, hey, do you know, I wanted to speak to you because I'm feeling concerned about you. This is what I've noticed. I've seen some marks on your arms, for example, or whatever it is you've noticed. I see sometimes that, you know, you have your sleeves rolled up, and it seems as though it's very clear to others that there's something going on here, and I just wanted to give you some time to talk that through if you would like to. I would really like to help you. I'd like to help you to think about what's going on for you. It looks to me like you might be struggling with something, and I want to support you to be able to cope with whatever's going on. And it's not, and the other thing I'd say, Becky, is it's not my job to tell you not to do it. And the reason I say that is because lots of young people have told us it's not very helpful to be told to stop, but it is my job to try and help you to find other ways of coping with things that hopefully are not going to do damage to your body. I would, of course, be passing information on to my safeguarding officer, and I'd be letting the young person know that I was going to be doing that, really, you know, at the top of the conversation. But that's how I would be thinking about it, approaching it with curiosity about what is it that young person is needing that is leading them to A, self-harm, and B, to be sharing it with others in that way. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, safeguarding was like the top of my list there too. But I think your answer gives a lovely way into how to approach, you know, addressing that with a young person. I think also I would say that it's remembering that, you know, every behaviour is a communication, and there's clearly, you know, some sense of safety that this young person feels in sharing, you know, what's going on for them in such a graphic way. And to me, that's showing that young person would like some support if they're visibly sharing the distress with others that feel safe.
Yes. So. That's a good point about safety, actually, that would say to me the young person does feel safe in the school environment and with their friends. And I think the other part of it for me, Becky, is because I think the person mentioning the question had said that they'd self-harmed in front of a friend. I'd also just want to make sure that other young person, or there may be a group of young people that are aware of it, are also being offered support, because that can be incredibly stressful for a young person, you know, to see that happening in front of them. Again, because they may well not know what to do. So there might be an opportunity to have some time one-to-one with the supporter, with the friend, and maybe to share some of these resources that we've looked at this afternoon, or other resources that you're aware of that could be useful. Pointing them towards the Life Signs website and similar websites. Young Minds have a lot of good information about self-harming. They often have dedicated web pages for friends and family. And that can be, again, as you said, very empowering, just to have a little bit of knowledge under our belt, so that if we're in that situation, we've got some ideas already in our toolbox for how we might respond.
Absolutely, and I think for the friends to know that they're not dealing with it on their own, and that there is a support network around that young person, that they're not dealing with a huge issue, you know, in isolation themselves, is so important. We've got another question here as well, Sarah. Yeah. We've got quite a few pinged through now. Okay.
Oh, good.
So we'll see how we get on. So we've got one. What would you suggest for children who seem to bounce between various self-harming behaviours?
I wonder if that's a question, Becky, about, so yeah, as we mentioned, lots of different ways that we could hurt ourselves. And I suppose where my mind is going first, I don't know if this fits for you, is again just being curious about what's happening. That there's obviously some ongoing feeling. There's some ongoing, like, potentially distress or feeling reaction that is expressing itself in different ways at different points in time. And I mean, I'm biased. I work for Place to Be, and we have our Place to Talk service. So we're all about the talking and about giving young people an opportunity to share their feelings and to share what's going on for them. So again, I would want to be just seeing if the young person's willing, would they like to have a conversation about what's happening when these different behaviours are happening for them? Maybe looking for patterns as well. Are there different, ways that they hurt themselves under different sort of stresses or triggers?
I think you've said it all for me, Sarah. I think you've said it all. We've got quite a few questions, so I'm going to try and fight through as many as possible.
See how we can do.
Okay, so the next one is, any advice on how to support parents of young people who are engaging in self-harming behaviours? I would say a lot of the resources that we've pointed people towards. I don't know whether you'd add anything to that, Sarah, but there's tons of information out there specifically for parents.
Yeah, we mentioned Life Signs. They've got some good resources for parents and carers, and yeah, Young Minds again. And just, I mean, there are loads of resources out there, folks. So please do have a little, explore for yourselves. But I suppose, again, just to say, it can be incredibly stressful for parents and carers. They might end up feeling quite guilty. Have I done something wrong? So I think it's just, as a school community as well, reaching out to families and seeing what supports might be needed for parents and carers and family members.
Okay, I'm just trying to decipher this next one. I think it's been split over a couple of questions. So I think it's in relation possibly to the pro self-harming stuff out there on the internet. Mm-hmm. So I was more asking what they are, to know what would be appropriate to share if you had self-harmed to a young person. Would it make them more comfortable sharing with you?
Okay, so I'm hearing in there, Becky, a question about, like, how can we use our own lived experience in a positive way, maybe? Mm-hmm. Is it a good idea to self-disclose? And I think that's a really interesting and very tricky question. Because for me, it very much depends on the context and your relationship with that young person. I think if I were working in a school, I would want to take that for a bit of reflective conversation with a colleague before I decided to share anything about myself, because although it could be useful to the young person, it might not be. And once it's out there, you can't take it back. So I think I would, if I were considering that as a strategy for supporting a young person, I would want to really go and have a good conversation with maybe a senior colleague about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, there's always a risk with any sort of like self-disclosure, isn't there? And I suppose we also don't want to overwhelm young people with our experience as well. So for me, I would probably, and this is just for me, stick with the young person's content and what they're bringing and connecting with them, rather than use my own experience, which might be potentially triggering as well for myself and might hinder my ability to be able to stay with that young person.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it's safer in general, isn't it, to use our experience, but not necessarily to name our own experience, to talk in more generic terms, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it conscious of the time, and I know Natalie would like to come and tell us about evaluation before we close, but is there one more question, Becky, that you think would be a burning question to answer?
Yeah, I think it's just people processing what we've said, Sarah, and people thanking us for the answers that we've given, really. So over to Natalie, I think.
Oh, great. Thank you, Becky.
Hello.
Hello, Natalie.
Hello. Just making sure my mic's working. I
realised
I was speaking and it was muted. So I'm here just to talk really briefly about our evaluation for the webinars. And all I wanted to say is that we've received funding from Education Scotland to run these webinars, and they are going to be made available on the website after being edited and refined and nicely polished. So I have put the link for the webinar evaluation in the chat itself, so you should be able to access it. It's very short and it should only take a minute or two of your time. But the reason we are sharing our evaluation form with you is because it would be a great thing for us to be able to get a better understanding of your experiences during the webinar, how you found the webinars, whether you think there's anything we could do better. And of course, we will use all of your feedback on all of your experiences to work on the webinars that we provide and the webinars that are offered. Yes, so that's in the chat. And if you have any questions about the questions in the evaluation itself, do feel free to email mhc@placetobe.org.uk and one of the team will get back to you as soon as they can.
Great, thanks so much, Natalie, thank you. And folks, I'm just popping up on the screen here a reminder of some of these sources of support for yourself. If you are affected by any of the issues that we've talked about today, or if it's brought up feelings for yourself that you'd like to have some support with, then don't hesitate to make contact with a supportive service out there. But for today, that's it's the point now to say goodbye, really, and just thank you so much for making some time to be with us this afternoon. It's been great to be with you, and thank you, Becky, as well for being my partner in conversation this afternoon.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And just some ideas here on the screen, folks, for ways you can stay in touch with Place to Be if you'd like to. Thanks again for joining us, and bye for now.